Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Hammer Museum. I'm Claudia Besser. I'm the Director of Public Programs here. Thank you. Paid that guy. I want to welcome you all to tonight's Hammer Forum on the search for solutions to homelessness in Los Angeles. The Hammer Forum is a monthly series of public discussions about current social and political issues, and it's made possible with the generous support of the Rosenblum family. Tonight's the fourth of a four-part series on the housing crisis. In the past three programs, we tried to drill down to the roots of the current housing crisis in Southern California and answer the most common questions and misconceptions about the unhoused, as well as looking at funding issues and building issues. But tonight, we're dedicating the whole evening to talk about what actually works. What are the answers to the ongoing housing crisis, and how do we solve it? But I do want to encourage you to watch or listen to the first three nights of the series, which are all available on the Hammer Channel website, and I highly recommend checking them out. Our moderator tonight is Anna Scott, a veteran journalist who's focused on housing and homelessness for over 10 years. She's a reporter for public radio station KCRW, and she also reports regularly on homelessness for NPR's national programs. She created and hosted KCRW's podcasts City of Tents, Veterans Row, and Samaritans. Before that, she produced the news programs Press Play, To the Point, and Which Way LA, and wrote for Bloomberg Businessweek, the LA Times, and other local publications. Anna will moderate tonight's conversation with Margot Kushel, Travis Stanley, and Pete White. Margot Kushel is a professor of medicine at UC San Francisco and the division chief and director of the UC San Francisco Center for Vulnerable Populations, and she's also the director of the UCSF Benioff Homelessness and Housing Initiative. She's a practicing general internist at San Francisco General Hospital, and her research focuses on the causes and consequences of homelessness and housing instability with the goal of preventing and ending homelessness and ameliorating the effects of homelessness and housing instability on health. She's the principal investigator of the ongoing NIA-funded study, The Health Outcomes of People Experiencing Homelessness in Older Middle Age study, which examines the causes and consequences of homelessness in older adults. She's also the principal investigator of the California statewide study of people experiencing homelessness. She speaks frequently at local, state, and national level about issues of homelessness and frequently provides testimony to legislative bodies. Margot is a board member of Housing California and the National Homelessness Law Center, and she's an advisory board member of the California Interagency Council on Homelessness. Dr. Travis Patricio Stanley is a retired Navy veteran. After serving in Desert Storm and Somalia, he spent a period of time without housing before recently moving into a beautiful brand new apartment building built for veterans in Silmar that was funded through California's Prop HH. He was recently interviewed for NPR about his experiences, and he was also featured in the second evening of the Hammer Forum on the Housing Crisis series. Pete White is the founder and executive director of the Los Angeles Community Action Network, LA CAN, which is a grassroots organization working to ensure that the human right to housing, health, and security are upheld in Los Angeles. Pete is a lifetime resident of South Central Los Angeles, and he's organized thousands of low-income people in a multitude of human rights campaigns. He co-produced the community festival Operation Skid Row, linking cultural giants like Chuck D and Public Enemy with the work of local artists and organizations to expand the collective bandwidth to produce change. Among his many accomplishments, he secured the residential hotel ordinance, cited as the strongest tenants' rights protection in the history of Los Angeles. Yeah, applause for that. It protected low-income people living in residential hotels from becoming homeless as a result of real estate speculation, market rate development, and gentrification. Pete has created numerous state and local laws protecting the rights of poor people facing housing displacement and discriminatory policing, and he developed strategies to pass two local ballot measures, HHH and H, resulting in a nearly $5 billion infusion of resources to build housing and provide services to homeless people. He's also featured in the critically acclaimed film Los Angeles, Skid Row is My Home, and numerous other documentaries investigating housing justice, food justice, criminal justice reform, and broad-based human rights. So now Anna, Margot, Travis, and Pete will have a roundtable discussion and then take audience questions. And then I invite you all to join us for coffee, tea, and cookies out in the theater lobby, and we can talk about all of these issues some more. So please join me in welcoming them all to the Hammer Forum.
Hello. Hi, everybody. Welcome. We are, excited for our last discussion in this series, but with a couple of repeat guests who, if you've been here before, maybe you've heard from previously because they were so great the first time, and a new guest, Margot Kushel. So, welcome. Solutions. All right, I'm just going to jump right in. We're talking about solutions tonight, and Margot, I want to start with a question to you, and then I kind of have a version of this question for each of you. But is there anyone out there, and I mean any city, any county, maybe any other country, doing it right? Any places you would look to as models on homelessness?
Well, I think outside the US, there are definitely places doing it right. You think of places like Finland, which has done a really good job in terms of social housing, in terms of like actually realizing that the way we get out of this mess is, by providing housing and providing housing. I think within the US, every place in the US is under the same general constraints, right? That this is one of the things that sort of amuses me about this is that mayors lose elections over this, but in a lot of ways they have the least control over fixing it. They have a few things in their toolkit. They're the people who the public is furious at for not solving it, and yet the public is never furious at Congress or the president who could actually make the changes that could get us out of this really quickly if they chose to do so. So in that sense, every place in the US is operating under similar constraints, but I think within that, there are places that are doing better. I look at Houston. It's been getting a lot of press recently. I've just gotten to spend a bunch of time with the former mayor, Mayor Parker, and got to ask her a lot about exactly what they did. And, in Houston, they basically had some things on their side, which is that there's sort of no state, it's sort of like a free-flowing state, right? So that could really go against them, right? Because they don't have a lot of benefits or whatever. But states in general don't have the power or the ability to actually fund most of what needs to be done. So it didn't hurt them as much as it helped them to have no regulations. They had land, they've built, and they've kept up with their housing. Lots of new people have moved in, and they've built housing enough for everyone who's moved in. And they just sort of stuck to the housing first principles. It's not perfect, but they're doing a lot better than a lot of the more, cities in the progressive, certainly cities in California are doing. So they're not doing great because they have the same problem that we can talk about that the entire US has, but they're certainly doing better than we are in California, where we can't create housing very easily or do a lot of other things we need to do.
Well, we're going to unpack a lot of that as the discussion goes on and spend a lot of time on different parts of it. But I do have a version of that question for you, Pete. Looking around here in LA specifically, Margot was talking about the limited power that mayors have, but we have a newish mayor, Karen Bass. How do you think she's doing? And beyond her, is there anyone in LA who's doing it right, kind of, that you see hope in?
Well, first, hello everybody. Thanks
We're
for
just
coming out.
jumping right
Yeah,
in.
exactly. Thanks for coming out and
No,
hanging
we're
out with us
niceties.
tonight. So a couple of things. I think it's a great question. So Mayor Bass is not a housing mayor, not at all. But that actually gives us an opportunity to present her with ideas. So when you listen to Mayor Bass talk about giving publicly owned land and publicly owned buildings to nonprofit developers, that didn't come from her. That came from the community. That's been something that we've been pushing for a long time. Just the other day in the LA Times, you saw that Mayor Bass went to the federal government and was able, and that was a great thing, right? Was able to reduce the time it takes for folks to gain access to permanent supportive housing that's been built. Again, that's something that we in the community has been talking about a long time, but we didn't have the leadership, right? We didn't have the leadership. We didn't have the guidon bearer that would say, okay, that actually makes sense. I do have some connections. Let's see if we can make that work. And so I think that where Mayor Bass excels right now is willing to try just about anything to put a dent in the crisis. And, after a number of administrations that were just stuck, right, and wouldn't try anything new. And, mind you, when I say wouldn't try anything new, we're not talking about rocket science here. We're talking about things like inclusionary zoning. We're talking about things like if there is publicly owned land, we should use that publicly owned land for people who need that. If there are buildings, if there are homes that sit unoccupied because the 710 extension didn't happen, we should put people in those houses, like very basic and simple things. And so she's a fresh breath of leadership that says, I will try. But the other thing, just on Marco's point, I think the general public believes like the mayors of these towns can make everything happen. Like they're magicians, right? And the reality is they are not, right? What they can provide is leadership and direction. And so what Mayor Bass now is running into, and she's not perfect, by not a stretch in the imagination, and we can talk about that, but she's also figuring out now that even with a new leader at the head, even with a mayor, the culture of the bureaucracy is still stutter steps and slow, right? And so when we get like Executive Directive 1, and it sounds good in the public, we're still fighting to get department heads and managers to sign on to the idea because they are there forever, right? The mayor is there for 4 years, maybe.
That
right?
directive was, you said
81.
81. What's that?
And so 81, Emergency Directive 1, this is where we're buying hotels and motels. This is where interim housing is coming up. This is all of the conversation. This is relaxing the policies. Purportedly, it's supposed to relax policies to develop housing, but I'm developing housing and it doesn't relax all the things that it should. And it's not that the mayor didn't put it out there, but the bureaucracy is like, we just don't do things like that. Right?
Yes. Bureaucracy has been a theme on these panels that's come up over and over. And it's particularly true, I think, in Los Angeles that the mayor has limited power to do things. It's different in every city, but LA has been called a weak mayor city. City council has a lot of power, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm going to back up in a second, but I'm starting this off with just shots of optimism. And Travis, I want to ask you, as somebody who has experienced
That was the optimism
homelessness.
section?
No, well, like
I'm just trying to figure it out.
People doing things right or on the right track.
Gotcha.
I think that's
Kind of.
optimistic. Yeah, even mixed reviews, I think, is pretty optimistic on this topic. And so, Travis, for you, I'm just curious, in your personal experience, what has been most helpful? Like, has there been a person or a program or some particular help or something along the way that you think stands out as the most helpful thing?
Well, I think for me, it all has been helpful because I knew how to draw from the good things and leave the bad things of those programs behind. For example, you need to know what specific questions you need to ask. If you need help getting documentation, how that process is going to work out, and so forth. And yes, I'm very nervous because I've...
All good. It is nerve-wracking to be up here, so you're in good company.
And Travis, we could not tell until you said that.
I had no idea.
We couldn't tell.
But it's better once you admit it, then it kind of like, it relieves some of the tension. But take your time.
Wow. There is one organization that really sticks out in my head, and that's the Center. It's in Hollywood. It's right behind the Church of the Blessed Sacrament. It's kind of like a homeless outreach. You go there like every morning for coffee and biscuits or something, and you start building community there. And that is something that I definitely needed because of my background coming from the domestic violence, from my substance use, and from being on the street. I really needed to learn how to build community again.
Mm-hmm. Well, community building along with bureaucracy is also a theme that has come up a lot on these panels. And, and a lot of when we've touched on solutions, it's come up a lot. And so one of the things I want to do is define solutions, because that's the theme of this conversation. But I think to a lot of people, clearing the streets of encampments is a solution to homelessness. There was a time in history when Skid Row was viewed as a solution to homelessness, which I think Pete can tell us about. And so, yeah, I'd like for you guys to talk about what you think solutions, means now, talking about it today.
See, no one wants to answer that question.
Okay, for me, solutions is not only having the inventory of housing, but streamlining that process. It makes no sense to have repeated documentation for different organizations that's already been submitted. Because to me, that bogged down my applications for a HUD VASH. Having to turn in a DD-214 that you already turned into the VA-1s, then having to return it again to VASH, then to the service provider. It's ridiculous. I mean, come on.
So it's like not just being able to say, okay, we have somebody and we match them to a unit, but actually streamlining the process of getting people into homes.
And the wait time.
Solution.
I mean, so there's no one solution, and I think we're probably going to be playing volleyball on this question for a second. But I think one of the solutions is getting the money back that HUD took in the 80s. And so the billions of dollars that HUD used to invest in affordable housing, we need that back, right? I think housing, like education, I think housing need to be viewed as a right, whether we call that the right to housing, but housing has to be a right. I think that when I started this work, the dominant narrative was, and we knew different, but the dominant narrative was people are houseless because of mental illness, because of substance abuse, and because they wanted to be. And then, if you wanted a cherry on top, houseless people all came from somewhere else because it was too cold over there, so they would rather be houseless in Los Angeles. Finally, that was 1992, and finally we get to a place where we know that that's not the truth, right? We know the structural underpinnings, right? And we've been talking about, we can go all the way back to redlining, but we can talk about deindustrialization. We can talk about the rising costs of housing. We can talk about gentrification. We can talk about anything. But finally, we're in a place where that dominant narrative, at least for a moment, didn't drive policy. And that's the problem. And so when we're talking about broken people, the only thing that you're going to give broken people who you believe are there for their own good is pushing, is banishment, it's incarceration. But when you understand in the city of Los Angeles, and much like in other cities, that 80% of those who are houseless come from your city, that means your city is manufacturing the crisis, then the policy directions change, right? And then on top of everything I said, those things we've been saying for years, but just I feel like in the last couple of weeks, study after study has dropped and says, the reason folks are houseless is because a lack of affordable housing. And I'm hopeful that this whole range of studies finally leads to a place where we can actually talk about it as a right, and we can actually talk about it as a problem that we all have to solve.
Well, one of those studies came from Margot Kushel and her colleagues very recently. So I was wondering if you could talk about that, and in the context too of what does it mean to talk about solutions to homelessness? Can we solve it, or are we talking about managing it?
I mean, first of all, of course we can solve it, right? We can do hard things. Of course we can solve it. Although we do live in a country whose sort of original sin is like stolen land and stolen labor, and that's, and that is why we have homelessness, right? And I think until we actually acknowledge that, and in a land where the original sin is stolen land and stolen labor, it's very easy to point to the people who have been stolen from and say, you're the problem. And I think that so much of this narrative is homelessness is like through the lens of the housed, right? It's a problem that there are people sleeping outside my house. It's a problem that people are getting in the way of the business. That's not the problem. The problem is that we have created a society where so many of our neighbors don't have a house and they're sleeping outside because they don't have a house. Like they can't go to Mars. Like where are they going to sleep? And so, but I also think that we need to believe we can solve it. And I think it's sort of the same political voices that want it, that it serves a purpose to have this problem, to have this boogeyman that are working against us believing that we can solve it. But to solve it, we have to center the most important voices in the room, which is not mine, which is Travis's, which are the voices of the people who are living this experience. And we also have to be like brutally honest. Like one thing I always say when I'm on panels is absolutely true. I have some family members here and they can attest to it, which is that I live in subsidized housing. And when silence, you could hear a pin drop because everyone is looking at me and everyone's like, really? Like you don't look like you live in subsidized housing. But my husband and I own our house, and any person in this country who owns their house lives in deeply subsidized housing because we, like other homeowners, did not have to pay taxes on our interest on our mortgage. And I work every day, and when I work in clinic, I work with incredible men and women who, do a lot of hard work, and pretty much none of them have ever owned a house. And in what moral universe do my husband, who's an attorney, and me, who's a physician, have our housing deeply subsidized by the government, and my patients, who some of them have severe disabilities and don't work, some of them work as house cleaners and janitors and Uber drivers, and the people who really make our country go, don't have any subsidy. And so, we have made a set of policy choices. I feel like the disinvestment in HUD was like the quietest, major policy shift. And everyone still says to me it's about deinstitutionalization. And I say three things about that. One is deinstitutionalization was 100% the right thing to do. People with disabilities do not and should not live in prison-like settings when they could thrive in the community. Two is it wasn't the problem that they were deinstitutionalized. It was the problem that we didn't provide the supports that they were promised, which, by the way, would have been cheaper than the institutions that we were so happy to pay for. But three, that isn't even the problem. The problem is that we totally changed how we subsidize housing right around the time that homelessness came up, and yet no one talks about that. So do I believe that we can solve this problem? Of course I do. Is it going to be hard? Absolutely. Is it going to take some sacrifices from those of us who have been on the good side of this equation? Absolutely.
Well, I have a question about your research, and then this will lead to a question specific to Travis. But we're talking about housing being, the baseline solution to this crisis, and we're going to go more deeply into what we're talking about when the different kinds of, housing that fall under that umbrella and drill down. But a lot of people, look around and say, well, I think, I thought the drivers were mental health issues, substance use disorders, because that is what I see. And so when I hear housing is the solution, to me that just means, everybody experiencing homelessness just needs, help with the rent. Well, that doesn't seem true. And you've done a lot of research on this and sort of, quantifying how you tease those things out. So can you explain how those things overlap?
Yeah. So your eyes are not deceiving you. People with mental health disabilities, substance use problems are wildly overrepresented in the homeless population. And it's not only because homelessness makes those things worse, which it does, and that is a big part of it, but also those things leave people vulnerable. There's this great book I'm going to pitch here called Homelessness is a Housing Problem. I love a book where the thesis is in the title, by Greg Colburn and Clayton Aldern. And they called me up when they were writing the book, and they asked, and I gave them an analogy, and they told me later that everyone they spoke to gave them the analogy, and then I think they wrote it up better. So I'm going to use their version of it, but it's this version of musical chairs. So everyone here played musical chairs at a birthday party. So imagine a game of musical chairs. There are 10 kids. There are 10 chairs. You turn the music on, the kids walk around the chair, and then the adult pulls away a chair, and the kids scramble for the remaining 9 chairs. So imagine a birthday party where the day before the party, one of the kids sprains their ankle. And they show up, their crutches are too big, they don't really know how to use them. And if you were a betting person and you had to say which of these 10 kids is going to be standing when you pull away the chair, it'd be a pretty good bet that it's the kid who can't quite figure out how to use their crutches, right, that's going to be standing when you pull away the chair. So if you ask the question, who is going to be standing, the answer is the kid with the crutches. But if you ask the better question, which is, why is there a kid standing? Well, there's a kid standing because you only have 9 chairs and either 2 kids are sitting on each other or someone is standing. And if you further that thought experiment and said, well, what if no kid had sprained their ankle? There would still be a kid standing. And then the even better question is, what if you had 10 chairs? If you had 10 chairs, that kid on crutches, it would have taken them a little longer, but they would have gotten to sit down. So the reason we have homelessness is we don't have enough chairs. And just to quantify that, in California, we used to be the second worst state in the nation. We've gotten a little better, and a bunch of states around us has gotten worse. But with us getting better, we are up to having 24 units of housing that are affordable and available for every 100 extremely low-income household. An extremely low-income household is any household that makes less than 30% of the median income of the area that they live in. So that's a lower income in Fresno than it is in San Francisco. That means we are 1 million units short in our state. It is a damn miracle that we only have 170,000 people experiencing homelessness in the state, because we have a lot of people sitting on chairs, sitting on top of each other on chairs. We have lots and lots of people crowded in. At the beginning of the pandemic, I was a person who called everyone in our clinic the first few weeks of the pandemic who was had COVID, and we didn't even have contact tracing set up. And I would just ask them, who else is in your house? I was scribbling it down on little envelopes or whatever I had laying around. And by the time I would get to the 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th person in the house, and I would say, how many bathrooms do you have? Because we were trying to figure out how to segregate people, and they would say 1. How many bedrooms do you have? 1. And I would call back the next day to check on them, and 5 people would be infected. And I'd call back the third day, and 10 people would be infected. And that's how poor people, who are mainly people of color, in our state live. And then every once in a while, people pop out. And it's, of course, not surprising that folks with substance use and mental health disabilities. But I can tell you, as someone who cares for people with substance use and mental health disabilities, there is nothing about those, first of all, don't scare me. They're not moral failures. They're not, they're not scary to me. There are certain health problems that are scary. Those are health problems. They're like every health problem. It has some genetics and some environment and some behavior and some choices, and all of those things mixed together. We have better treatments for some than we do for others, but there's nothing about having either a mental health or a substance use problem that means you need to sleep on a tent on the street. But when it is brutally hard to find housing, when, in our study, the median household rent in the months before people became homeless was $960 a month. The median rent for a 1-bedroom apartment in California is about $1,700 a month. It's not surprising that the folks who have impairments that make it hard to work 3 jobs and to crowd in with 13 people are going to be the people who pop out to the streets.
Thank you. Travis, I was hoping you could tell us about anything you want to pick up on there, one, but also in your experience, the difference between being in a temporary shelter and now in permanent housing in this building in Sylmar area. Yeah.
Okay, so temporary housing is like being in combat. Me being a recovering addict, I always fight against the addiction. But when you're in transitional housing, it's always coming at your face constantly, and it's so tempting. I was in a VA program where it was just like that, and I wind up relapsing there. So I think that's a big failure for everything. Is when you put somebody like me that's been on the street into a program, is to hopefully get them to that higher level, to the next achievable goal, which is eventually permanent housing. But there has to be something in place to make sure that happens. And just having a transitional housing that's just open, that you come and go as you want or do what you want is makes it more difficult for people to get housed. Because thank God my relapse wasn't as bad as it could have gotten. Wow.
Yeah,
Feelings, gotta love those feelings.
gotta love them. Yeah,
Yeah.
well, no, it's intense. And I mean, take your time, but I've been to where you are now,
Yeah.
and there is a lot of wraparound support there, it
There-
seems, and we've talked about
Oh, there is now, yes.
Yeah.
But when I went through there, it was, excuse me, it was very difficult for me. So being an addict, and then having people come at your door all night long. Hey, do you want to buy this? Do you want to do this? I need to sleep. When I don't sleep, it triggers my mental health stuff with my PTSD, my anxiety, and all these other beautiful isms that I have. I don't even know where I was going with that now.
Well, it sounds like a really stressful environment, and actually, you're also touching on a policy issue that that I want to talk about, which is the need for supportive housing for some segment of the unhoused population, and what that means. Because one of the things we'll talk about tonight, you guys can jump in, is housing first, which is become this very politicized approach to homelessness, but there's a lot of research behind it, and I think it's misunderstood by a lot of people to mean housing only. And this is something Travis and I have talked about how, oftentimes people need other supports once they're in housing. If you are struggling with a substance use disorder or something like that, you might need help with that. And none of that is, excluded from housing first. But I think a lot of time people hear housing first and they're like, oh, you're saying that we just give everybody a free apartment and that's the end of it. But it's not really what it means. So I want you guys to jump in on that, but I didn't want to cut you off either. But I wanted to point out that you're getting to something that I wanted to ask about.
So actually, you're right. We did talk about that, where I said something like to the effect that you cannot put somebody that's been on the street for 40 years into an apartment community, because what happens is that community becomes unhealthy. I'm bringing my addiction or my other isms, and it starts to spread around. It contaminates the community and makes it unhealthy, because eventually that might, the SUDS might spread to another person, and it's just a mess. If this is my personal opinion, if I wanted to be successful, treat the underlying issues first. I think that was the goal in those little tiny white houses, is to bring those veterans off the street, get them treatment, then house them. Because then that housing becomes permanent. I mean, permanent, not just in title, but in our own actions. Housing anybody that's inactive, whatever ism, is eventually going to just get me evicted and out on the street again. And how easy it's going to be to rehouse me if I have an eviction. It's going to be very difficult. And then it's a major shot to my self-confidence, ego, and all those other wonderful things.
Well, yeah, let's pick up on that, because I think the ideal, right? What if you do it all at the same time? What if someone can have all the support they need, also housing?
I want to go there, but I have to go back to some stuff that Dr. M said for sure. And for me, it always has been about how we ask the question, right? And so, that leading narrative about mental illness being a main driver. I was reading Dr. David Wagner's book, Checkerboard Square, where he shows that the rate of mental illness in the houseless community is just a little higher than the rate of mental illness across the housed community, right? And so it can't be, mental illness cannot be the driver. The same thing on substance abuse, right? The rate of substance abuse in the houseless community is just a little higher than in the house community. But when we think about America, we're addicted to everything. But everyone doesn't wind up houseless. And then we have to ask why, right? And then when you start asking why, so some folks have great health insurance because folks have jobs and folks have different types of resources and services in those who have nothing. And so we can't just stop the conversation like, yo, the rate of mental illness is X without actually sort of interrogating, but what is the rate of mental illness for housed folks? Like, you have to ask both things. The other thing that's really interesting, and so of course, rent drives people to the streets, but we also have to talk about, oftentimes when we talk about houselessness, and this is across the country, we only talk about visible houselessness. We're always talking about what we see. And what we see is not the totality of what's going on. And so when Doc was talking about people doubling up and tripling up, we're talking about houseless folks. By federal definition, those folks are houseless, right? Oftentimes, right? If folks don't have a stable place to be in 30 days, they are houseless. And so we have to, if we're going to talk about the crisis, we have to also talk about the invisible crisis. Because when we start talking about the invisible crisis, we then start talking about different solutions. Then we're talking about, okay, let's stop the inflow, right? We don't want another person in. And then the last thing I'll say, Dr. Dan Fleming and the Economic Roundtable, they did a study I think it was 4 years ago, and the county fought them tooth and nail. They did not want them to release this data that 50% of those who exited houselessness, and that was right before COVID, exited houselessness on their own, right? And so sit back for a second, because, we're passing Triple H at that point. We're passing H at that point, billions of dollars. But no one's really talking about folks and how and why they're exiting without any of that help. And what that really means, if you kick back, what it means, and it's still a sad tale, but what it means is someone lost one of those 3 jobs that you talked about and could no longer afford housing, could no longer afford rent. And by hook or crook, figured out a way to get that 3rd job back, and they exited houselessness. That 3rd job is interesting because when you talk about $1,700 a month for a single apartment, and then when you multiply that by 3, and when we think about what makes housing affordable to you, it's only 1/3 of whatever your income is. And so here in Los Angeles, you literally have to make $100,000, $110,000 to actually afford to have that $1,700 a unit actually affordable. And so what we're really talking about is people are working hard every day. Those folks who are keeping this city together, but they're spending to the upwards of 60, 70%, 80% of their money is going towards housing. That's unsustainable. And then when we're looking at the COVID cliff, and those numbers, there's been a couple of reprieves. But, I've rang this bell a long time, and this is not the optimistic story. But if we don't figure the COVID cliff out, what we see on the streets, it pales in comparison to what could happen, right? And so if we don't, my optimism is we will fight hard enough. We will push hard enough. Some folks will get smart enough to know that whoever is housed today, we have got to do everything in our power to keep them housed. And then we have got to take every bit of resource that we can and get people off the streets. Because if we don't, those shanty towns that we saw all those years ago are going to be all over the city again. And I know that's not optimistic, but that's what's in front of us. That's what the data shows us.
That's okay. That's okay.
I'm going to come around optimistic again.
No,
but we can. Yes, we can.
Well, I do want to get very specific on this housing question and how you create more of it and what we're even talking about. But I also, Travis, you were talking about your experience in temporary shelter and in the difficulties of that. And then I also wanted you to explain where you are now a little bit, because for people that haven't seen it, I've seen it. But yeah, explain what it is. What is this building?
So I live in Sylmar. It's a supportive housing for veterans, and I love it up there. There's a social worker, I forgot her title, Jesus, engagement coordinator. We have a peer support there. And the best thing about this is that it's a nice, peaceful community. And I get to talk to other veterans that are going through the same thing that I am. Because there's some days that I just want to run screaming. And there's days that I just want to isolate and just not come out and do nothing. And when that happens, I have a group of veterans and a beautiful staff that will come up to my door and go, "Are you and Kenzo okay? Are you and Kenzo okay?" And that's what I need sometimes, is somebody just to show up at my door and say, "Are you okay?" It's a one-bedroom apartment. It has a great view of, I don't even know what those mountains are. Might be
Real
San
mountains.
Gabriel.
Thank you. Somebody.
But I have a
Probably.
beautiful view of the apartments. Utilities are included, and it's my home. And, well, it's my and Kenzo's home. I think my therapist has called it that we're nesting now, which is a new term for me.
Well,
Yeah, it's
and we
our
met
home.
because this was a building funded through Prop Triple H, which was this measure that passed here in the city of LA to fund permanent supportive housing, which is this particular kind of housing that's subsidized. So the subsidy comes with the apartment through the federal government. You pay a portion of your income towards the rent, and it has these services on site. You know, caseworker and counselors, and so, but. And that's one form of affordable housing that we, I think of a lot when we talk about affordable housing. And I think sometimes when we say we need more housing, that is the thing that comes to people's minds. But there's a whole spectrum of different kinds of housing. I mean, you know, what about the person who can just afford $500 a month in rent, but doesn't qualify for any subsidy and lives in Los Angeles? Where could they go? You know, what about other forms of cheap housing? And so, yeah, when we say that the solution is housing, like, what are we even talking about? Like, what could we do? What are the concrete things that we could do to make things more affordable?
I mean, I like saying everybody needs housing that they can afford. Some people need housing with a lot of supportive services. Some people need housing with a little supportive services. And some people just need housing that they can afford. I mean, and I'm doing this ongoing study where we've been following a group of older adults who are homeless in Oakland. We've been following them for 10 years. Every 5 years, we recruit some more to join them, but we meet with them every month and interview them every 6 months. And like the optimistic part was that within about 2 years of the study, 80% had gotten housed. The pessimistic part is that of those who got housed, 50% returned to homelessness within about a year. And what were the things that kept people housed? If they got a voucher, if they had permanent supportive housing, or if they just had a voucher, because many of the folks out there don't need all the bells and whistles. They just need housing they
So
can
like
afford.
a Section 8 voucher?
Section 8 voucher. So Section 8 vouchers, formerly called, the official name is a housing choice voucher, federal program where basically it's for use on the private market. That if you have a voucher, basically you can rent an apartment, you pay 30% of your household income, the federal government picks up the rest. Lots and lots of problems. Landlords, particularly in tight rental markets, discriminate against Section 8 housers horribly, so lots of work to be done there. Lots of folks who really need them but don't meet the very strict requirements, so lots of problem there. But the biggest problem of everyone in America who meets the really strict requirements for them, 1 in 4 get them. Can you imagine if Medicaid worked that way? Like, you met all the requirements for Medicaid and you show up at the hospital to get Medicaid and they say like, sorry, going to put your name on a wait list. And like in the Bay Area, every 10 years, the wait list opens for a day or two because the wait lists are so long that they don't even put people on the wait list. But there's been really good research in family homelessness that showed where they actually compared all these different things, like lots of services, transitional housing, where people like learned a lot about how to be, I don't know, a good poor person. I'm not really sure what they were teaching them, but something. But lots and lots of things, or handing people a voucher with all the problems with vouchers. And by far the best outcomes for the moms, for the kids, for housing, for health, we're just getting the voucher.
So is this one of the things you said earlier that the federal government could do something overnight? That could help
If the
alleviate
federal
this?
government
So
overnight
fully funded that program.
made it an entitlement as opposed to something that you have to wait 10 years in a lottery, most family homelessness in this country would disappear overnight. It would over it would change the dynamics. Look, in a city like Los Angeles, it's really hard to use those vouchers because there's no funding. But for the developers who want to build affordable housing, what they usually say to me, and you probably know more of this than I do, is that they're like, I can usually come up with a capital between state money, local money, federal money to build sometimes, but I can't sustain it. Because someone who makes $900 a month and can pay $300 a month isn't paying enough ongoing costs that I can actually keep the roof on. And so it would change the market dynamics because it would allow us to create a lot more housing. That is a decision Congress could make tomorrow. I have to say, like, I'm a housing nerd. And I'm also kind of a nerd. And so I would watch all the political debates and things. And it was I don't drink, but it'd be like a drinking game if anyone said the word housing or homelessness. And it took, we have a lot of fun in our house, but it took, then everyone cheers. It took until really the last round of presidential elections where homelessness was mentioned once. Housing vouchers, I nearly lost I was cheering and jumping up and down, just to have it mentioned. It's really hard. Build Back Better actually put in not a full funding, but an increase in housing choice vouchers. It got slashed before that bill got passed under whatever name it's now called. We can't get it through Congress. And that's the thing that, there have been estimates of what the federal spend would be, but it's not that much more than what we currently spend on homeless shelters, and fewer than half of people experiencing homelessness are in homeless shelters.
So what else? That's one. We could fully fund Section 8. What about the physical shortage of housing in cities like Los Angeles or other parts of the state where haven't met their housing goals for many years, and that's
something mayors
contributed
can
to
do.
things. So
that's something mayors can
what do you do there?
Zoning.
Yeah, that's all zoning. I think the other thing, something that you mentioned, Doc, is, and so the very first thing, when we talk about affordable housing, that's a misnomer. And particularly when we're talking about affordable housing for poor folks and the limited programs that exist to build that housing. And so most developers will say, not to get too nerdy, but there's a program called the tax credit program. This is a program that developers use to help cobble together this capital that Doc was talking about.
Coupons sort of from the IRS
That's right.
that affordable housing developers get. They can sell them to banks or whoever, and they get cash to build their affordable projects.
And
it's
the rub,
very
Anna.
Complicated.
The rub is those tax credits, they build 30% and forward, not 30% and below. And so everyone that we see actually on the streets, we're not really developing with the tax credit program. We're not developing housing for those folks. And so
do you want to slow that down? I get it because I'm not sure the audience got that 30% and above.
Thank you.
I know what you mean, but why don't you?
Yes. And so you were talking earlier about area median income.
So people earning 30%
of the area,
median income.
Or
so these projects are usually for people earning above.
It's above, right?
Okay.
It's
so
well
not
above.
The poorest people
we are not
that
building,
we are seeing.
We're not building affordable housing for the poorest folks, right? And so oftentimes, there's lots of developers who are building housing. They won't even tell you it's affordable housing. And in your mind, and this is where it's like, I was going to say a mind something, but y'all know this is where your mind, it's like it's bewildering, right? Because when we think about who qualifies for affordable housing and who's in affordable housing, you have some professionals in affordable housing, right? You have lots of teachers, you have firefighters, you have all of these folks in affordable housing. However, when I say the word affordable housing, the very first thing that someone thinks about is, oh no, that's the projects. And in reality, the majority of resource that's going towards affordable housing development actually isn't going towards the folks who need it most, right? That's not where the resources are going. And so one of the shifts is let's make sure we have resources in all programs like these tax credit programs or whatever that makes it possible to develop at low and deeply low and extremely low and zero income, right? We have got to develop housing across the spectrum. The other thing, and this is one of the things where when you're talking to mayors, this is where you have to separate the campaign from the reality. And so in Triple H, when we were fighting for Triple H, right? Everyone who voted for those 10,000 units that we're still waiting on, everyone thought that was for every houseless person that you saw, right? You thought like, boy, 10,000, that's gonna be it. And everyone I see qualifies. What they never said, what they never told you in the small print, it was for folks who were extremely vulnerable only, right? And so folks severely disabled, folks duly diagnosed. And so it was never for everyone, right? It was never for the houseless person who was just a paycheck away. And so we've got to find ourselves in a place where we quit siloing communities. We have actual goals towards housing that brings everyone in. You know, is it possible? Yes, right? Do we have to get back to some form of social housing in this country? Yes. And we should not be afraid to say the word social housing. I've been all across the globe. There's some pretty nice social housing in other places, right? And it's nice because there's investment into the social housing, and the social housing is right next door to market rate housing, right? There's not this separation. And so the services that everyone needs is right in your community.
Yeah, well, this is a question I had, and so maybe you guys can continue on this, but are there models, outside the United States of public housing that isn't what we think of? Because this tax credit system that Pete was explaining a little bit about, where private developers, often nonprofit developers, they get these credits, they sell them, they get the cash, they build their projects. This was all a system that came about, after we really stopped doing public housing. And now it's really private developers that build affordable housing or subsidized housing in this country. And yes, there are reasons for that. I mean, I'm from New York, and New York is not a good landlord if you live in public housing in New York. And so I think people are really familiar with those problems, but there are other models of this kind of housing in other places where it doesn't have this stigma, or it's been done better. What are those places? Like, is it anything that could ever exist here given our political system and economy?
Oh, you're asking for optimism for our political system? I mean, could it happen here? Let me point out one of the reasons
Travis says no.
It's
no.
not happening here. Again, as like the white lady in the room, I think I can say like that this is so, that the main way Americans have built intergenerational wealth is through home ownership. And that until very, very, very recently in our collective history, Black and brown Americans were excluded from that, not just because of an individual bad actor, but because the government said that was okay. That was the law of the land. And that is the main reason, actually, for the enormous wealth gap between Black and white communities. And so as soon as you start talking about actually repairing that wound, we get back into a politically difficult thing, because I can assure you that if homelessness was impacting white communities at the levels it's affecting Black and brown communities, we would be having a very different discussion. So is it solvable? Of course it is. I don't know about how optimistic we can be about our current body politic, but there are lots of models. I mean, Northern Europe, Vienna is getting a lot of
I've heard a lot about this. That Vienna has a lot of public housing that's nice. And it's not, and it's sort of,
it's decommodified.
A lot of people
basically.
choose to live in it. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like a public option
And it's it's that.
I love the audience. Yes.
Yes. I mean, as someone whose family home was stolen by the Nazis in Vienna, I'm always a little touchy about it being like held up as the like absolute ideal, because it's also on stolen property. But it is actually a really good model, because it's not just sort of like one part of the population. What they have really done is that is not how people become wealthy in Vienna is not, there are lots of other ways you can become wealthy, but it's not through your home. And it's so politically, it's like the political fifth rail for any politician to like reform the mortgage interest tax deduction. If we reformed the mortgage interest tax deduction, we could pay for an enormous amount of housing, but that is a really politically difficult thing to do because so many Americans, our wealth and our children's future, people is in their homes, and so it just becomes a hard political discussion. But pragmatically, it's not that hard to do. There's nothing magical here, and and I think about the affordable housing. Like, there are 2 or 3 things. One is I absolutely want my children's public school teachers to live in our community. Like, that is a good thing, right? But again, we use this term affordable housing. It's really housing for teachers and nurses and firefighters who absolutely should live in the communities that they serve, but it's not getting at this problem.
And what about just cheap housing? Like, how do we make more of that? Like, what about it's not subsidized? Just like, whether it's like what about is that even possible? I mean, I guess SROs are sort of a form of that, but
But I'm going to take you back to that other question before we go there. So Sweden, Portugal, I mean, some stuff in Denmark, Norway, like social housing is a thing and it's beautiful and they're taking care of the workers. I think the other thing, moving away from socialist or non-socialist countries, right here in America. And so when you think about social housing or public housing in America after World War II, it was for GIs. It was for white folks, right? And then, the GI Bill came out, and then the federal government was giving loans to some and not others. Then you had that thing called redlining, and equity was developed. And so there are examples of where it worked here. Yeah. Just not for everybody.
Just not for everybody.
Just not for everybody. And so we don't have to go, oftentimes, we feel like we got to board a plane at LAX to go find something. And it's right here.
Right.
It's in our DNA, right? But it's what you said, Doc.
Right.
We don't want to have the hard conversations about it. And during the George Floyd moment, everyone wanted to talk about all these things, but that window closed, right? Before we could actually shift policy towards a way that we can, talk about this issue of bringing everybody in,
And I would just say, pay attention to the language around this stuff. Like, the states, California has some of the lowest, we have good ways to measure sort of mental health in communities and substance use in communities. We're really on the very healthy population level for mental health, and we're definitely in, the better half in substance use, depending on what measures you use, but we're at the rock bottom with homelessness. Why? Because of our housing costs. But, California, everyone talks about this. Homeless people are all moving here from other places. They are not. Our study showed, it's proving the obvious, except we felt like it was important to do. 90% of Californians who experience homelessness in California lost their housing in California. A significantly higher percentage of people experiencing homelessness in California were born in California than all Californians, myself including, who was not born in California. 75% are living in the county at which they lost their housing. It's actually, when you stop and think about it, when someone is in crisis of losing their housing, the thought that they're gonna board a bus and go to the state with the highest cost housing in the country, it's actually sort of absurd when you think about it. But that's what everyone thinks. I travel around the country talking about homelessness, and I will tell you that every community is convinced that homeless people are coming from someplace else. It's actually almost funny if it wouldn't be so sad. But we talk about that. We talk about mental health and substance use as if they're these crimes against humanity and unsolvable and whatever, because we don't want to have the hard conversations. So this is solvable, but we need to actually decide to solve it, and we're not going to solve it by trying to fix people who are seen as broken.
And I think the other thing,
I have a question
we were
for
just going to
Travis.
take you away. I was going to take the facilitation.
But he's been quiet for so long.
Go ahead,
And I want to go from big to personal. I'm curious to know if there was a point that you can identify when you look back at your own history. Was there a point where there's an intervention you can think of that would have been helpful, that would have prevented you from having to deal with homelessness at all? And, what didn't happen?
I would have not got married. So my homelessness was caused by domestic violence. My soon-to-be ex-husband hit me over the head with a baseball bat. And once I came to, I did not want to go back. Gee, I wonder why. All my friends knew this was going on, and all my coworkers, but nobody wanted to say anything because, it was not the correct thing to say.
You can take your time.
Sorry.
No, don't be sorry. It is very stressful. Of all the panelists, you are sharing the most personal things here. And it's nerve-wracking in front of an audience. And it just gets the emotions running. I think, we all understand it.
Yeah, I would have not got married. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because there really was no other, even with my PTSD or having been raped during active duty, none of that was an issue. Not until that one specific point.
Yeah. And do you think, once you're in a situation where, now you don't have housing because you're leaving this awful domestic situation and you don't want to go back, does it compound? Once you've lost housing and now you're out there kind of at the mercy of, whatever's available, do the problems sort of pile up once you're in that situation?
Oh, most definitely. They increased by 1,000-fold. So I stopped sleeping altogether because when you sleep on the street, people will steal stuff from you. No matter who, they might be your friends, but they will steal from you. My addiction got worse. It definitely kept me sick. And because where there's no food when it's cold, what am I going to turn to? The thing that's going to make the hunger go away and keep me warm. And then it broke a lot of connections. It isolated me a lot. I stopped being a person and just survival mode, constant, nonstop, 24/7, 365 survival mode.
Yeah. Well, this is one of the things that I wanted to get to before we go to the audience questions, which is, when we talk about solutions, there's always the question of cost and what they'll cost and what kind of investments we have to make. But we don't often talk about the flip side of that, the cost of homelessness, which in quantifiable ways, but also the personal tolls that it takes on people experiencing it, society as a whole. I think you just spoke to that. What are those other costs associated with how things are now?
The cost of doing nothing is so high. In the study, it's a representative study of adults experiencing homelessness in California, 10% had been sexually assaulted during this episode of homelessness, much higher among women, among trans and non-binary folks. 36% or something had been physically assaulted. People just talked about everything falling apart. Everything fell apart. And that is kind of the root of the idea behind Housing First, is it's hard to put those pieces back together when someone is trying to figure out how they're not going to get assaulted, how their stuff isn't going to get stolen, how they're not going to be freezing or hungry, or all of the other things. And that's sort of the intellectual roots of why we want to start with the housing. But there are also all the costs. There are all the costs that never get counted. The amount of money governments spend moving people, hungry, cold, sad, desperate people, moving them from one place to another place is unbelievable. The amount of sort of public safety resources and things we spend just moving people around. The impact on people's use, institutional cycling. 30% of people in our study had been in jail for a short period during their time homeless. Now, I'm pretty sure if people were axe murdering, they weren't going to jail for 2 days, but we just pick people up, put them in jail, and put them back out on the street with even less than they had before. That's not only horrendous for the person experiencing it and actually disarms everything else, but it also costs a lot of money. We're keeping those jails full with people just doing that. The cost for healthcare, the amount of increased admissions and increased visits and increased readmissions is tremendous. And then there is the costs for like businesses and things. Like if you ask the tourism industry, I spend a remarkable amount of time talking to like hotel owners because like trying to like talk them off the ledge, but like it is really terrible for tourism and things when this image. And I think also like just the cost to our collective humanity. Like one of the things that I do sometimes is go to meetings where they're trying to cite low-income housing, and all these people come out in matching t-shirts screaming about their children because they're worried about their children from these people moving near their children. And I was at one of these events. They're always incredibly unpleasant. One night and getting yelled at, and I just called on one person who wasn't wearing the t-shirt. And she said, I am, my name is so-and-so, and I'm a teacher in this community. And I'm a middle school teacher, and I know a lot of your children, and I spend all day with your children. And your children see the suffering out there, and your children are looking for you, for the grown-ups, for the adults to do something. And I, too, am worried about your children, and I'm worried about what it means for their moral development, what it means for their sense of safety in the world. And then they handed the mic back to me, and I was like, yeah, what she said. Like, but it was this really incredible moment of like, there are so many costs. They're like, we could calculate all the costs. The shelter costs. I mean, bad shelter costs $100 a night. Good shelter costs $300 a night. It's like we spend an enormous amount of money through our inaction. It is going to cost us a fortune to get out of this mess, but it is costing us a fortune to manage it too.
Yeah. Anything to add to that on the cost? No, you're good? Okay. Well, we'll go to audience questions in just a second, but for each of you, like, I often get people asking me, okay, so there's these huge policy changes that need to happen to solve this. But what about the individual? A lot of people do want to help and do want to be constructive on this issue and really don't know how. So yeah, like what's something that an individual could do? And Travis, what would you say from your personal experience? Like what would have been helpful to you from just some regular person?
Talking to me.
Yeah.
Just talking to me. Not make me feel, but help me become a person again. And a smile. Yeah, just a smile. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely that. Offer to buy a meal and ask the person what they want to eat and sit and share a meal with them. That's important. Be that teacher who on that Tuesday night, when I'm sure she had like a million papers to grade and other things to do, got out of her home and went to that meeting and was brave enough to stand up in front of her neighbors and say, yes, I want this beautiful new housing for people who are currently homeless to be in my neighborhood. I want it to be there. And she'll get shouted and booed and yelled. But when I talk to people, they're like, oh yeah, I wouldn't mind having low-income housing in my neighborhood. I would love to have that, but we don't show up to the meeting. So be that person who shows up to the meeting. Hold your electeds accountable, but hold your electeds accountable for real change. And please hold your federally elected folks accountable to not just your mayor and not just your governor and your state senator. And then the last thing I would say is like push back against this individual narrative. We're fighting, like Housing First has become this like radical lefty idea brought forward by the radical lefty George W. Bush, who is a total San Francisco lefty. Like it's not a radical idea really, but we're like really fighting against some really icky forces out there who are trying to convince us to keep the status quo. And so be that unpopular person at the cocktail party who says, no, it isn't mental health and substance use, and who really thinks about the real roots of this crisis. And because if we recognize the roots, we'll see our way out.
I think for me, even when I look around this room, the proximity to the issue has changed. When I started the work, it was just those people over there, just those people on that side of town. And now you see it on every block, on every side of town. But what that also means when we talk about cities and counties and municipalities manufacture their own crisis is that people in this room and abroad are also just full of anxiety about these things that we're saying tonight, right? And so don't be silent, don't be embarrassed about this structural issue. If you're going through it, talk to someone. Come out, hang out, educate yourselves, but talk to someone about it, right? Because it's happening in many more households than it used to happen in, right? So the first thing is acknowledge that you could be in that chair tonight, right? And if you are, find an organization, right? Start an organization. Talk about what your needs are in your community. Do that as soon as possible. Next, believe half of what you hear. Believe half of what you see and none of what you hear from electives. I'm saying interrogate the crisis. Like, we've been up here an hour and it's pretty simple. I mean, it's simple now because I've been doing it a long time. But if you just ask yourself the simplest question, you'll figure it out. You'll be like, wait a second. Maybe I have some issues with substance abuse, right? But I'm not outside. Why, right? Like, so let's ask ourselves the hard questions. And then let's stay optimistic. Let's say that we can solve this crisis because we can and act like we can. Organize, don't agonize is what we say.
Organize, don't agonize. And Travis, could you plug your podcast real quick? Because maybe it's premature, but eventually people can hear it soon, right?
Yes, very soon.
Yes.
So I'm launching a podcast. It's entitled I Do Solemnly Swear. It's basically just a bunch of veterans talking about our experience as veterans and interviewing providers at the VA. So the new coming veterans can get a better understanding of the VA system and how to navigate it a little bit more better than I did.
A public service, for sure. Well, we will look for it on all the platforms. I think it's a good time to go to some questions if there are some. The audience, I see there are hands. Somebody's out there with a mic, so if you're, that's why I'm not calling on you because they'll give the mic to people.
Thank you all so much for sharing your perspectives on this issue. I think is it working? Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay. For context, I am a medical student at UCLA, and I've been working in a street medicine capacity with a lot of our homeless community. And I think something critically missing from both our approach and our solutions is this notion that's become a really dirty word in America, which is that of harm reduction, which is meeting the folks with these needs where they are and catering our solutions to them and not kind of existing in this abstract space where there's a schism between the moralism and the ego placating of politicians and people removed from the issues and the tangible things that will actually help the people who actually need to receive these services. And so I think it is so important not to reduce this population to substance use and mental illness, but the truth of the matter is it does exist, and I think the difference is that in this community it's lethal, where it might not be lethal in other communities. And so all of that is to say, I think there's a lot of the reasoning behind why certain statistics are the way they are, the 50% of homeless people who get housed and end up homeless again, there is a sense of community and safety that a lot of homeless people feel on the streets. Today, for example, we met with one person who had OD'd last night, and the only reason they had survived to talk to us today was because their neighbor had went in and checked in and gave them Narcan. But we have projects like Project Room Key, where we just senselessly put people in rooms with nobody to check on them and punitively punish them if they use substances by kicking them back out. And so many people have died because of these solutions. So clearly there are some solutions that are just not meeting people where they are. And I think housing is important, but as it exists today, it seems kind of far away. And to get the people that are homeless today, that are living today, that are dying every day today, to that, we need to help them in these transitional liminal spaces where they get stuck on along the way. So getting comfortable with things like harm reduction, giving people use clean needles, Narcan, to stay alive long enough to when we have the housing available to give to them is also really important.
You know what's funny? You know what's funny about that in Los Angeles? And so Los Angeles has been a harm reduction city since 1994ish.
Yeah.
It was like Richard Riordan. And so we have a whole conversation now. You know, we've had progressives in office who are up in arms,
Yeah.
but they forget that this is a harm reduction city. This is a city that purportedly supports harm reduction. And so still a lot of work to do, but every time that I can remind the Bass administration and others, I'm like, you're governing a city who by policy has signed on to being a harm reduction site. And though since 1994, we've had raids of exchange needle programs. We've had raids of folks carrying their harm reduction materials. And so while there's still a lot of education to be done, I will remind, and I encourage you to remind folks that this city is a harm reduction city.
And I think it's also, 100% everything you said. Someone who's dead can't get housed, right? That's like the most obvious thing. But I also want you to know and believe that housing can be done in a way that fully supports. Like we have some really cool, in a couple of our supportive housing buildings in San Francisco, they enlisted the residents. They paid the residents to be harm reduction champions. They basically put Narcan sort of like boxes on the, sort of like you break it open to, they were sort of like vending machine, but anyone could get it. They had people know their community, and if someone was going to use a loan, they were strongly encouraged, to use in community, but if they were going to use a loan, they were encouraged to let someone else know, and that person would go and check on them. And in those buildings in San Francisco, we are losing people day after day after day to overdose. Nobody died. Nobody died for a long period of time. This is not rocket science. It makes some people deeply uncomfortable to acknowledge that people have always used. Bars are harm reduction, right? When people get a bit of alcohol, they know how much alcohol they get. Their bartender cuts them off. Bars are just a socially acceptable form of harm reduction. We can do this, and it is not in contradiction, but this is what I would call the small p policy. A lot of these things happen or don't happen based on decisions of like individuals and organizations on the ground.
Thank you. Another question?
More questions.
Yeah. Someone's coming around with the mic, for sure. Yeah.
So one thing that you were talking about was the cost of homelessness, and kind of one part of that is that there are people making money off of it, and they're making a lot of money off of homelessness, people who own jails, people who own the buses that we're using to ship people around, landlords like the ones in New York City who make so much money that they're actually going on a strike and holding their rent-controlled units off of the market. I was wondering what we can do as community members who often don't have the same resources that those folks who are making money off of this problem do, to contend with that and to fight back against them.
Yeah, just one word. That's a great point. It's organized. It's organized. It's organized. It's getting as many people together as possible to acknowledge and to talk about it. That's the only way that it changes.
There are more people not making money than there are making money. And so that's why it all comes down to organizing, right?
Be a loud voice.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Thank you. Comment and then a question. I moved from Detroit 35 years ago and was very uncomfortable with all the homeless people. I didn't see that in Detroit. And about that time, a reporter did a many-week report on the homelessness in the LA Times, several pages every week, and I read it so closely because I wanted to know how to approach this. And there were no answers until the very end. And, how am I supposed to treat them? And the answer was, you make eye contact, you smile, you acknowledge them as people, exactly what Travis said. And I think that's blew my mind. Anyway, speaking about the money, 40 years ago or so, our president started dismantling some of the laws from FDR that kept the rich paying 90% and the working class getting a reasonable percentage of their work. And those laws have all been put away. And it seems to me that if the working people, the working class, were getting their fair share of their work, and we reinforce those laws, that we wouldn't be feeding so many people on the street.
Right. I mean, it's so many things happen. Like everyone talks about deinstitutionalization, but it also happened to correspond with the withdrawal of funds from HUD, the really decline of unionization. You meet very few older. I do a lot of stuff with older folks who are homeless. You meet very few older folks who are homeless who are in unions. And whenever I hear people talk about pension reform, I say, "Oh, you mean homelessness promotion?" Yeah, I'm very popular, but I think that the unionization and then mass incarceration and those three things. I mean, these are macro forces. So just be aware when people start to talk about these individual failings as opposed to talking about the big macro forces that are causing this calamity.
Over this way on your left. Y'all can hear me. Oh, there we go.
Yes, we can.
Thank you for that question. That kind of was getting into what I was going to ask, so I'll pivot a little bit. At the beginning, we were talking about this idea that policy has limited a lot of the opportunities in terms of electeds kind of staying true to perhaps what they've promised when they're running. And so I'm always someone that's thinking, okay, how do we then use maybe the failings right now where there's more room in the private market to say, hey, let's try to develop solutions here if policy's not going to do what we intended. So I'm curious if maybe you can talk back about some of those nonprofit solutions or developers who are in the interest of developing social housing and kind of getting back to some of the things that once existed.
I mean, that's a great question. It's interesting when we think about gentrification. For a number of years, when it first hit Los Angeles in the early 2000s, everyone thought it was about market. Like, that's market forces. That's the private market. The reality is that policy paved the way, right? It was policy that created sort of the environment for gentrification to thrive. It's always that way, right? The subsidizing rent and bringing in new, it's always there. For me, I don't think it only happens in nonprofit spaces, right? It has to happen in market spaces as well, but there has to be controls. And so for me, one of those controls is like proper rent control, like the rent control we used to have in New York, or inclusionary zoning, making sure that everything that's built, there are units built for everyone, right? In whatever the developments are. I also believe that when we think about leadership, and I have to go back to electeds, I think, and this is something that I spoke with the mayor about, I said, I think what you have to do, you have to cobble together all of the resources, like wherever these resources are coming from, the federal government, the state government, the local government, you bring all of those resources together, you put a number on what types of subsidies you're willing to give developers. You attach that number to the global amount of units, and you create the environment. You create the conditions by which folks build that number. And even if the number comes back at like this year it's going to be 5,000 units or 10,000 units, at least we all know how many units we're going to get. And the development community also knows what they have to do in exchange for these resources. And so it's not, to me, it's not ever going to be like just full private or full government. I think, though, I do believe the full government part for me is we've got to make a wholesale investment in social housing, like a wholesale investment. And then stuff that happens outside of government, inclusionary zoning and things like that.
What is social housing? Would you define it?
Yeah, I mean, social housing is subsidized housing, housing that's subsidized by the government.
Yeah.
Yep.
We'll take a couple more.
Hi, thank you all so much. Hi.
Y'all are back, the whole front row.
That's right. Thank you. With being a person with this schizoaffective diagnosis, with 11 years clean from heroin and meth and crack. Great love affair that didn't work out. But, laws like, care court really scare me because schizophrenia is, targeted. With substance use disorder, in remission, bills like SB 43 that expand the definition of gravely disabled to include people within the substance use community, including those that are at risk of relapse. Knowing that there are no places for people to go that are using drugs outside of jail, right? So I know that this is a future of mass incarceration and the displacement, the further, or like Pete says, the banishment of people, because Pete has taught us that displacement is where people go. Displacement is where people, like, if you have somewhere to go, then you're displaced. But if you have nowhere to go other than jail or death, that's called banishment, right? So I know that you mentioned the federal policy, and I thank you for that, because I do believe that our governor has higher political aspirations that are fueling, these really violent approaches, right? And the legislator is, they're saying things like, we wanted to vote no, but he won't sign our bill. So it's just nonsense, right? So knowing all that, and knowing that the Olympics and the World Cup are coming to California, specifically Los Angeles, do you think that LA is ready for the Olympics, and how will we protect our, right? So before we go out to buy our Olympics, shirts and stuff, how do you believe that the Olympics will impact communities?
Well, this is for the panelists. But yeah, we did one thing in your question that we did talk about in a previous panel, that people aren't following care courts. This is a proposal from the governor to come up with something that's sort of between a conservatorship and nothing for people with very serious mental health disorders. And it's been sort of, I think, pitched, we talked about this before, but pitched as a fix for homelessness, kind of playing on a lot of the misperceptions that the panelists have talked about, really, I think the verdict of the previous panel where this came up was that that's a very disingenuous way to, sort of cynical way to try to sell it to people. But anyway, so you guys feel free to talk about that, but I guess, the thread is there a lot of pressure now to fix the visuals of the problem and push people away because of the Olympics coming.
And higher political aspirations.
Yeah, and our politicians driven by their aspirations as much as really wanting to solve things.
Yeah, not optimistic. I mean, I sort of, this is like we in our field, in our in our work, we talk about there's a prison abolitioner, Mariam Kabami, who says hope is a discipline. And when we get really down, we all together say hope is a discipline, hope is a discipline. And so one of my hopes is that in many years, we're going to look back at the way we treat mental health and substance use now and be so shocked in the way that we laugh at medieval thoughts that epilepsy was like possession by the devil. I hope that my children's children are going to look at the language and the ways we treat people with substance use disorders or with mental health as possessed by, we basically treat people as if they're possessed by the devil. And, and then we banish them to institutional spaces. And so I think it's really important to keep reminding people that, mental health disabilities are sort of part of the tapestry of humanity. It's just different ways that people exist in the world, and that people with deeply disabling conditions, disability is like an interaction between an impairment and your environment. And if you can create the environment where people can thrive, everybody can thrive. Sometimes people need, brief help? Sure, that's always true. Like whether you're talking about diabetes or schizophrenia or whatever, but that people should be allowed to live with sort of freedom and self-determination, and that I think sometimes we wind up for our lack of imagination and our lack of sort of building the structures that would allow people to thrive. We then get afraid and start talking about institutionalization and things, which actually doesn't make a lot of sense. If the whole problem we're so worried about is how much money we're spending, not only is it wrong in a million other bases, but it's also incredibly expensive. So I think we just need to keep reminding people that that there is another way to do it. I tell people my favorite part of practicing medicine is I take care of a lot of people in a program called Assertive Community Treatment. It's a program for people with very severe mental health disabilities. Many of my older patients had spent 10 or 15 or 20 years at Napa State Hospital, a state psychiatric institution. The younger ones didn't, but had they been older, they would have. And these folks live with incredible, I love them as patients, I love them as people, incredible dignity, incredible courage that they walk through the world with. And they're housed, and some of them have volunteer jobs, some of them have paid jobs, some don't, but we can do this. We can do hard things. I think politicians, I spend a lot of time with elected officials. I like elected officials. I think elected officials don't get that far out of the public. And I worry sometimes when we pin things on elected officials, we are not taking not individual, but sort of collective responsibility for what we're saying. And we need to back them when they're making the right decisions and encourage them and get out there and fight for them, because at the end of the day, they have to keep getting reelected. So I don't know about, lots of politicians have political aspirations, and ultimately they listen to their public. And so we just need to be louder.
But for us, we have to also say do no harm, right? And so when we're talking about SB 43 and Care Court, when it first started, we were talking about severely mentally ill people. And then they started throwing in things like substance abuse, right? And then they started saying things like, okay, anyone could make a call on anyone and get them before the courts, right? And then they had this whole thing around conservators. And so just in case anyone didn't know, conservators for poor peoples are jails and prisons, right? And then at the end of the day, they would give you a care plan if this thing passes. And in this care plan, you have to do things like find housing or go to services when housing doesn't exist. And if you don't do those things, now you're at risk for conservatorship. Now, how many ways can that go wrong, right? And so it just goes back to something that folks said earlier. It just continues to build another industry, right? And I like to call these industries of oppression. And the other thing about Care Court, mind you, there's no resources in the bill for those things that actually provide care. The only money that's in the bill is to build up courts and jails and prosecutors. And so this is where yes, it's campaign season, and whatever sounds good to get elected is oftentimes what our elected officials are doing if we're not organizing and if we're not interrogating what's put in front of us. And these things are very important. Care Court would just be another thing that we're funding out of our dollars that's not changing anything, right? And so we have to say, do no harm.
Yeah. Who knows what's in our elected officials' hearts, but you can't go wrong by assuming the worst. I think that it's getting really late. I know there are a lot of questions. That is the journalist approach. Assume the worst, but you're open to the best. But we don't know. But yeah, I know there's a lot of questions, but we'll be outside for a little bit after this. I think, we can wrap it up just in the interest of time. But there'll be an opportunity to chat with us outside if you want to stick around for that. But if you're tired, go rest. And thank you so much for coming.
Thank you guys for
Thanks
coming
to the
out.
panelists.